Professor is here with us in the studio. Professor Stefan Dercon is a professor of economic policy at the University of Oxford. He is also a former chief economist at the FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, formerly known as DFID. Mm-hmm. There has to be 4 letters. They've got to be 4. If they made it 5, it would be a different thing. If they reduced it to 3, it would be a different thing. Prof, good morning.
Well, good morning. Very nice to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. You've done a lot of work on development, and then you've authored a book. And the title of the book is Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. It's a gamble. Okay, we're going to talk about all this. So let's just start with your background as a professor of economic policy. How long have you been teaching this at Oxford and elsewhere?
So, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I started my academic work in East Africa, was based in Tanzania, studying rural development. And then I've been for 20 years studying East Africa and the Horn. I look at farmers, rural development, all kinds of things. And then 10 years ago, I got a chance, despite being an academic, to actually step into working in government. Mm-hmm. As you said, the DFID, the Department for International Development, was the aid agency of the UK. And so they put me there as chief economist without, as a civil servant, no political connection. I'm not even British by birth. And so I had 10 years of working in the policy space. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose my background is a little bit strange now because I'm academic, but I've seen up front working with politicians, decision makers all over the world. And so I spent my last 10 years traveling around, working across Africa, also in South Asia, and learning, which is what is the most joyful thing to do.
You're avoiding one part of what you've been doing, which is looking at development from an aid perspective.
Well, actually, it's an interesting thing, is that the one thing I've learned, and even in the book I've just written that you cited, I have 13 chapters, and it takes until chapter 11 before I even mention aid. Mm-hmm. I don't think aid is the central story of development. Successful stories developed. Aid may have been useful, and there will be countries where aid has been useful. But it's the countries that develop, and aid may have supported it. It's not the other way around. Aid doesn't develop a country. So I looked at it from that perspective. And yes, I'm still, coming from Europe. We are aid donors. We try to do it. But I was definitely always trying to tell people, start with the country. It's their development that you may want to support, but it has to come from inside.
Many might argue that aid actually cripples a country even further than it would help it.
So I think I'm going to give a slightly longer answer to you because you're right, and I will come to that point. The way I like to think about development is, and it's the winners and the losers that I describe in the book in the title. It's, every country is a coalition of power, of powerful people, powerful groups. People in the politics, military, business, sometimes civil society, public intellectuals. And I talk about countries, essentially, it helps to think about countries as fundamentally a bargain amongst powerful groups, elites. Mm-hmm. Now, you can have lots of these different elites, and you could have elite bargains, as I call it, deals between the elite that actually are purely clientelist. If I'm in power, it's my time to eat, and I make sure I line the pockets of those who supported me. If I am controlling the state, I'll steal from the people, and that's how I do it. Or, as successful countries did, they actually had an elite bargain with all the self-interest of all the different people involved. They actually were interested in growth and actually growing the country and doing development. So that's what these different success stories have in common. And for me, they're very different ones. That can be China, it can be Indonesia, it can be Bangladesh. I think it can be Ghana. It may even be Kenya these days, where actually you said you can have an elite bargain for that. Now, how does aid then work? Well, if there is somehow an elite bargain basically those controlling powers in the country, they want development. Well, aid can support it because you work with them and you actually extend the balance sheet of government and can do it. But you have a problem in some countries where fundamentally the politics and the business community and the military, whatever it is, they don't really care about aid, but something very different. Then aid can actually make it worse. It can actually lock in a terrible elite bargain and actually undermining progress that is possible. So we could talk maybe later about some countries and examples, and I'll get in trouble here with it. But
We do it every day.
yes, but that's basically it. So it can cripple it because, if the incentives in the country are totally different, well, what are you doing? Are you compensating for the failures of government? Or actually are you embedding a bad structure and making it actually worse?
But then I hear you talk about it from the recipient of the aid.
Yeah.
The recipients, the government, those in the private sector, those whom you're calling the elite bargains.
Yeah.
They're looking at, all right, so this aid is going to come. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to benefit directly from it? How about the source of the aid?
Yeah. So, yes.
And the motivating factor for this particular country to put up this kind of agency that will be going to offer aid and development to these developing countries.
So one thing I already noticed in the way you discuss the book, and I will want to push back a little bit. I will answer your questions. Don't worry about it. As I said, chapter 11, 12, 13, there's 10 before. Okay? Understand what's going on in the country first, and then see what an aid potentially does.
Yeah.
Now, I am not someone who's going to say that international aid is always given with the best of intentions. I absolutely will not say that. In fact, I worry that we're going to in a bit of a bad patch now because geopolitics. And it's not about particular countries, but with geopolitics coming into it, there is a risk that we are going to support in aid again the kind of crooks like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, in Congo, who actually was a crook and was a kleptocrat and was actually stealing from his people. But actually, because of geopolitics, we ended up supporting that regime in the 1970s and 80s. So you are potentially, doing this. So, and that's a big risk. But, I am a strong believer that a country should be firm and actually saying, look, we should have our own development strategy. And if you're willing to develop and grow, aid donors should be willing to assist it. But say no if you don't want it. I've worked a lot in Ethiopia, for example, as a country that very strongly had a view in the last, up to about 2020, how it was actually going to use aid. And it had a strong agency. And I remember conversations there and saying, I'm not sure we want you to do this project. And that's great. And I was always fully supportive of a government saying that we don't really want to do it. Because the only way to get development is it comes from within.
I agree with you. And I think, look, if we're looking at development from the different stages of development, I liken it to a baby, for example. Unless this child unless there is a fundamental physiological problem, this child will go through the stages on their own. They will get up, they will crawl, they will get up, they will walk, they will fall, but essentially they must do it on their own to get through the developmental stages. And I think you can liken that to what happens in a country, maybe a little bit basic, however, following some of the same tenets, that it must be allowed to go through the cycles of development. After all, those that we call world powers today, by and large, went through the rigors of development. However, there are many who argue that there exists a world whereby those powers today will not allow a situation where these developing countries then will be able to actually develop on their own, because they will then eventually get into a place where they could contend with said world powers.
Right. So now I'm going to argue with you on this point, because I agree with you up to a point. So I like the analogy, actually, and I'll come back to that, the analogy of the thing, because you put learning central here. You put learning, but progressing as well, I have a son, and I remember when he was very small, I can actually encourage terrible bad behaviors and encourages good behaviors as well. Okay, so learning is something, it has to be progressive as well. But we have to be very careful to, because you said the developing world. Actually, the more I look, and also in the book I discuss that, the developing world doesn't exist anymore. There used to be in the 1960s a very clear one set of countries that looked in a very similar way. Okay? We have actually had, in the same geopolitical situation that's faced by lots of different countries, some that actually took advantage of the opportunities. And yes, I agree with you, they may not always have been as widely available as we should have made them available as seen from global powers. But they took opportunities, East Asian countries, but also strange places like Bangladesh took opportunities. Bangladesh was written off totally as a basket case. In fact, Henry Kissinger, remember the US Secretary of State, called it a basket case. In fact, I just came actually I was spending a little bit of time, lucky me, in Mauritius, and I was just spending time with it. Similarly, in the 1960s, a Nobel Prize winner called James Mead said, nothing will ever come from this country. This country is on the brink of high income status now.
Wow.
Nothing was going to come. So you have these places that were totally told nothing. They took up advantage of the limited opportunities. That's what I call the winners. They are the ones that actually within the set of constraining factors, they took advantage, and there's others not. So even in sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritius, yes, maybe it's a bit of an exception. But if I start looking at Ghana, and there I say, when I start looking at East Africa these days, they're taking opportunities that several other countries, including maybe your home country,
you can say it.
Nigeria, not taking opportunities, not taking the opportunities. And I think that's the difference. Ghana and Nigeria is a fascinating comparison. Ghana, with all the constraints it faced, since the 1990s, is taking advantage of the opportunities. It's growing much more solidly, doing sensible things in development, doing sensible things in the politics, transitions of power and the whole thing. Nigeria feels quite stuck. And so, that's a bit like where I push back on you and say, look, within all the constraints, which I take exist, I love to look at the places that actually take advantage of the opportunities. And, if you can do a Mauritius, get to high income status in that constrained world, if you can do a Bangladesh from desperation, getting into a much better place in poverty and also business opportunities and so on, then I say, look, there are opportunities. So we should not simply, and this is a bit more a general point, we can't reduce it all to, history, even colonialism, that clearly constrains a lot of countries. But I love to look at those places within their own internal forces, take advantage of the opportunities. And there are quite a few of them. And that actually is the story of the last 30 years that I want to tell in the book. That there are these countries, despite all the constraints they faced, they start doing much better. And what's the recipe? It comes from internal. It's what happened in the country. They took advantage. They played with us, the international donors, wonderfully. And there's plenty of great examples of
Maybe that's the story.
How they actually learned how to actually use the narratives of the international donors, how to use the IMF and the World Bank, how to use them in their countries to help them progress according to their own recipe that they wanted to do. And so that's the bit where it comes back to the child. Every child needs to find their own way, but needs to progress. And what I don't want to have much sympathy with is a country that says, I should be allowed to learn, and meanwhile descending into stagnation or kleptocracy and not doing anything, because that's not learning anymore. That's consciously actually simply using the state and the way you run the state simply for the interest of a small number of people.
So then it sounds to me, and what I'm hearing you say is, those that succeed, there's a common thread.
Yeah.
And the common thread is leadership. Because then you've got a leadership that is focused and determined on the path that they want to take, and they follow through on that path. And they're able then to stand up to anybody who is coming and telling them, this is not the way you should do it. They're like, no, this is the way we should do it, because we are convinced that this is going to lead to something bigger.
Right.
All right. So, gambling on development, why some countries win and some countries lose. Apart from leadership, why else do countries win and others lose?
So, and this is where, I keep on disagreeing with you, and that's why we're here. Because the word leadership, actually, I don't think it ever appears in my book. And I will explain to that. I don't like this naive enterprise, a bit of the analogy of the private sector, as if in a firm, the CEO is everything. If the CEO doesn't assemble a good team, the CEO is nothing. You know, if you go to Silicon Valley, they will tell you it's the team that we invest in.
Yeah.
We don't invest in either the idea, we don't invest in the development plan, so to speak, or we don't invest in the leader. So it's leadership in a broad sense. So what I'm actually looking at is, in the first instance, a group of people, and that's why I keep on talking about this elite bargain. You know, they will involve business leaders. They will involve civil society leaders. They may involve public sector leaders, politicians as well. In fact, I was talking recently to a former Minister of Finance in Ghana, and she was emphasizing the not in power elite is just as important as the in power elite in the political space. So it's this kind of idea of there is an underlying...
So what's your argument again on something? That's
a bit of an element
leadership,
of
isn't it?
Yeah, no. And that's why I say I don't want to use, because often people reduce it that
To
every
presidents.
country must have the Lee Kuan Yew or you have to have the Paul Kagame. And I've nothing wrong in itself with the idea of having really fascinated visionary leaders like these kind of guys. But it's often a bit more. So what else do you need? It's actually probably you need, and I actually say you need three things. You can't just have the words. You know, you have plenty of leaders that have the great words and the development plans.
Yeah.
So you need to kind of be willing to operate what I call credible politics. And credible politics for stability. That means somehow knowing very well when to compromise with other parts, when not. So to actually because stability is the key part of it. The second thing you need is something about this old debate about should it be the state or should it be the market. I'm actually simply saying your state should be self-aware. It should understand what it can't do, what it can't do. Let me give a quick example, which is basically, if I'm in China and I have 2,000 years of centralized bureaucracy, meritocratic bureaucracy, centralized taxation, if I'm Deng Xiaoping in 1979 and I win the battle against the ideologues to be more pragmatic, because and he forms an elite bargain amongst the reformers to say we're going to do something different. We're going to actually do a different model. Basically, it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. So we're going to be pragmatic in our policymakers, as he is famously said. Then I can see that you use the state as the instrument for development. If I come to Bangladesh, where the state was built up, or lots of states in Africa after independence, where the first thing that needs to be rewarded was the people who fought in the independence war.
Indeed.
And then every time you get in power, you need to make sure that those get a chance to eat that get into who are actually appointed. You have a clientelist state, a state that actually, maybe shouldn't entrust it to lead the economy. You should actually have confidence that, okay, they can exist that as part of the elite bargain, the political bargain, but then maybe you do it more via the market. So in Bangladesh, and in fact, we also do relative success here, or in Ghana, is actually you started recognizing that it shouldn't be always the state that does everything.
So let the market also
And
have
let
a
the
role to
market,
play.
exactly. And so it's self-aware what you can do. If you have a strong state, you can do it. But don't have this illusion you have to look like East Asia is the only way to do it. And then the final thing comes back to your learning point as a child. It is about learning. Because the biggest problem that all these countries have, in Mauritius was an interesting thing. 3-4 times they had a deep crisis in these early 15 years, and they had to totally rethink what they were doing. They were in the middle of structural adjustment when they actually learned to do something else, and so it's the learning, it's basically to doing it. And you have to have a system that forces you to learn. In China, how did they force them to learn? Well, strong party discipline, internal accountability. If you didn't deliver the targets, you were sacked as a civil servant. I don't think if you're here, the nephew of a minister, you will ever be sacked. In Ghana, it had to become via the democratic transition.
So allow me to interject and ask
Yes,
a question
please.
with that. Then, some of these policies that I'll give you an example. Here in Kenya, with the funding that came from the international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, there were certain, what do we want to call them? Conditions that came along with that.
The Kenyan way, conditionalities.
Conditionalities. Reduce your workforce, get rid of subsidies, get certain things done in a certain manner. We're going to give you this funding, but we want to make sure that certain things then fall in place. Through that, when there are these conditions that hang overhead, right? Because it's really not a condition, more like putting the arm behind the back and saying, do it, or we're not going to be able to help you in this manner. Do you see a throughway in all of this? That when you clearly, I mean, we're at a point, it was at a point in Kenya whereby in order to fulfill the fiscal year, the budget, to finish that, funding was required to finish that. And this is for paying overheads. This is for paying salaries, right? In order to finish that, you needed this aid. From an external source, it's then also saying, well, in order for you to do this, then reduce your budget. It's too big, number one. Number two, get rid of this subsidy thing. Number three, sort out things here with education and that. Can you find a through way with the throttle around your neck? Can you do that, in your opinion?
So the interesting thing is that, that if you look at the countries that were quite successful, and I'm thinking of Ghana, it was an early structural adjustment one in the early 1980s. Indonesia used the IMF very smartly. Bangladesh, several programs, used the IMF very smartly. And why I'm actually getting this to this point is a bit like using it smartly, is that, economics, and especially about growth and development, anything goes doesn't exist in economics. You can't just do anything. At the same time, I think we've learned that to be able to grow an economy, there is not a single narrow recipe, but it tends to be a little bit of a broader space, okay? Maybe in the 1980s and so on, the periods that you refer to, maybe the recipes were a bit small. But
No, I'm talking about now.
Yeah,
2022.
Exactly. Okay, no, that's an interesting thing. That's why I actually say.
Yeah.
There are certain things. There is no economist that will tell you that you can actually, get back to growth without some form of macroeconomic stability. You'll need to be able to do it. Now, there's two ways of using this. You could say, oh, they impose all the conditions onto me and so on, and some are right or wrong. Countries that I've seen being smart, they carefully think through what the kind of underlying deal is that they make around that, and they're very smart. So historically and even now, you see countries getting these conditions that actually probably your Ministry of Finance or your central bank probably approves of. But they find it quite useful to have the IMF impose it because politically it's very difficult. Okay? In a way, the way to think about the IMF in that sense is a little bit like an extension of an independent central bank. You just need somehow, there is some constraining factor because politics sometimes can't deliver the sources of stability. And where you said at some point you need to go for a cash budget. At some point, whether I live in Britain or in Belgium or in America, I have to at some point look at my fiscal situation. And as a small country, I come from Belgium, as a small country, it's a bit like Kenya. We can't improvise as much as, for example, the US can do itself. So, to keep your macroeconomic stability, you need to certain things. So the smart players, they think very carefully about, and actually they use the international financial institutions to help to deliver something that's very difficult politically. So if you look historically at Ghana and Indonesia and Bangladesh, that's how they used them, to occasionally help to stabilize the system, because it had to happen, even when it's politically very hard to do. And so you become part of it. So actually, in that sense, I would say it becomes a bit part of that elite bargain as a way of sustaining the stability. So, and I wanted to just put it back, Economics imposes some constraints on you. You can't just do anything goes. There are trade-offs. And in this kind of environment, I'm very sorry, if you want to bring inflation under control, you'll have to do certain things. And in some places, it means input subsidies reduced. In other places, it means being careful with the size of the state. We'll have it in Britain. We'll have it in Belgium. You'll have it here. Unfortunately, that's there. But use these international institutions. I don't mind if you blame them for the conditions. But I don't believe in conditions, by the way. I don't think that they should be the ones imposing it. The smart countries are where your finance ministry and your central bank smartly finds a way through, working with the politicians in the country and say, okay, we better go to the IMF because politically you're not going to be able to do it without their support.
Right. Using them cleverly. 26 minutes to 10. Let's take a quick break. Professor Stefan Dercon is a professor of economic policy from the University of Oxford. He's also a former chief economist at the UK's development agency, now called FCDO. the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, formerly DFID. He's here with us talking about his new book, Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. And of course, you can hear the interesting perspectives that he's bringing to
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Eric Latif Nduoko, our colleague CT, is away today. Our guest is University of Oxford Professor Stefan Dercon, who is also the author of Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose, and telling us, well, from his own experience, this is what he's been able to observe, and he's put all that in a book, a very interesting one. So, Prof, just off what Ndu was raising earlier, in terms of how do you use the external factors to your advantage as a country. And then also going with what you had said earlier, you've got to look at your own internal circumstances and then decide what your internal circumstances are and then how you're going to use the external. Now, we have very many examples of very many good ideas and plans. Kenya, for example, is replete with perfect plans, perfect reports and strategies. The problem comes with the implementation where then things just are not able to flow. What is it that causes this? What is it that causes the inability to implement a plan?
So, look, there will be several factors, but for me, the core one will be, and where you need to start from, is that implementations requires really that you want to implement it.
Sure.
And a very fundamental thing. We observe in a lot of countries across the world where policy statements are being made because they need to be made, but there's actually enough interest in the coalition of power, whether it's business interest, political interests, and so on, that say, well, we can't really do it. So we make the big statements, but actually we don't want to do it. So it comes back for me again, is that when you start observing why is there limited implementation? The first question you have to ask is it in the interest of those in power to actually implement it? And if it isn't, it won't be done. That's the fundamental thing. Once you pass that, of course, implementation, I've worked in government in the UK. It's incredibly hard to get things done, even if you want to do it, and we have to learn and so on. And then it comes back to that willingness to learn from the mistakes, being able to when is the last time you have a politician in any country of the world saying, by the way, we tried to do this, but we failed? It's incredibly difficult for a politician to ever admit that something they tried to implement was a failure. So you have all these constraints from implementation. But I come back to it, look at the underlying bargain, the elite bargain for power. Do they want to do it? And I think the most important reason why things don't happen is that. And fundamentally so.
But also, let's be fair to those people. Maybe they actually want to do it, but then there are other factors, even internally, that are so strongly opposed to you doing it because they're interested in the status quo. So you may come in here and you really want to change things, but the powers that want status quo to remain are stronger than yours.
Yeah.
What do? In the case of China, Deng Xiaoping wanted to change. But of course, he faced a lot of opposition at the very beginning, and he had to radically change the government.
Yeah.
But you see, that is a system of government that's different, where the boss now is the boss.
Yeah, but Eric, you make this perfect. That's a perfect point. The elite, typically, those with power, are mainly interested in the status quo. Okay? So this is a bit like why I don't want to overstate this role of the one leader. The powerful, the effective leader is the one that builds the coalition for change. Deng Xiaoping had to build a coalition for change in his own country. In Mauritius, that's what the founding president did with the business community. Built the coalition for change that was broad enough and to actually do it. So it's not, so I agree with you. You may be the big man, the minister, you may be the president, you say, I want to change it. I see it, for example, President Chakwara in Malawi, it's a very complicated political things and very little ever gets done. He, I think, probably wants change, but it's incredibly hard to get it implemented because the first point needs to be done, which is that coalition of power that wants to be done. So it's not about one person wanting to do it. It's actually, can you build a coalition of power that actually wants to do it? Can you overcome the business interest, the other interest in the politics and so on to do it? And actually that's something. And when we look at successful countries that had an elite bargain for development and growth, that's probably what the common factor was. If we look at East Asia, in China, since the 1980s in Bangladesh, we got that. I would say in the 1990s, even in Ghana, that's probably what you got. And, I think I see signs of here. It's better than it was 30 years ago in that respect. It's better than it was 20 years ago, and we've had, we can argue about whether Kibaki was better than Kenyatta was as president, but these are... it's been progressing. So you begin to get a better elite consensus that the idea of growing the economy in a sensible way, developmental to do it. And that's what you do it. So it's not the simple leader here. That's the task of the leader. It's actually built that coalition of people.
Well, but the leaders that you've given as examples are leaders who actually had power enough to be able to bring people together into this so-called coalition. Very many of them were not, I don't really feel that they were willingly joining the coalition, more than they felt that this is the better place for us to survive by joining the coalition. So the leader
or understands the elite interest. So if you go to the different countries, think of China. We end up talking a bit on China here, and it's quite an interesting thing. Why did Deng Xiaoping manage to get that coalition, this reform coalition, together? It's because it was a matter of survival for the Communist Party of China. I'm old enough to remember that people talked about, will China survive this period? So it was actually a quest for legitimacy. It's a quest for the sustaining of the position. In Indonesia, President Suharto in the early 1970s had to do this. In Bangladesh, it's really interesting. Everybody recognized that the elite bargain shifted to be more growth and development oriented in the 1980s. Nobody can date it. It's a bit like the signing of the elite bargain will not be televised. It will not, there is no moment. It's an implicit consensus that emerged between different people in different paths over time, and it becomes strongest. And it's about your behavior being more consistent with it. Therefore, I'll start behaving more. It's the opposition politician behaving in a certain way when they're in power. You start behaving in a particular way, and so on. That's, for example, in Ghana, very striking with the transitions of power. They were actually remarkably peaceful since the 1990s. From a very fractured political system, they went to go it. Can actually complement the country here in the terms of the way the transition, even though people have strong views about it. This is not 2007-08, and you get somehow a way to handling these transitions of power. That's part of that elite bargain that actually becomes stronger and more stable and hopefully more developmental. So these countries, it's not about a big whip. It's actually, I like to look at leaders are the ones that actually manage to build consensus. Sometimes people say the big part of a leader is to be the communicator in chief, telling the story that everybody feels part of that story rather than the commander of chief, because otherwise you may command and nobody follows you.
And just coming off of that is that, look, and I think about coalitions, and I think that has become almost a buzzword for the political scene on this side of the pond. And that means that you will enter into a coalition, not necessarily because you believe there are certain developmental strategies then that will be followed for the country, but you do that for your own personal political expediency, that you must then remain relevant in the political sphere. If you don't do that, if you don't get on the side of Eric and Stefan, then the likelihood of you remaining politically viable reduces significantly.
But that's the essence.
But the thing is that, are we saying that you kill two birds with one stone?
Yes.
That you get into this coalition, doesn't really matter what your personal thoughts are, but if this person who is ringing everybody up, if they know that's where they're going, then you can bring these other people who are going to pay homage to you, and that you can then get into it anyway.
Look, we talk about, say, business elites, business communities. Look, we know very well, and I'm pragmatic enough, that they are not necessarily start being in business and building up a business because they just want to do socially good. They could have set up a small NGO. And I have no problem with it. That's the way the system works. A politician loves power. A business person loves money and profit. So the fact that these things coincide, that's for me pragmatism. That's basically recognizing that these deals they make with each other, they do it either for survival or because they see opportunities. But can I just stress, because my book is called A Gamble on Development, and the gamble is because what you said, Eric, earlier, that the status quo is very attractive. The status quo system. You know who you need to pay to get your favor.
It's comfortable.
It's comfortable.
Yeah.
The gamble comes with growth, and we see that throughout history, including in Europe, that growth changes who's part of the elite. It gets new entrants. Think of tech. We were talking in the beginning, you were mentioning it. Tech is this kind of new kid on the block that actually changes the dynamics of the old power structures. And growth is a gamble for them, but they do it because they see, well, either I will lose power because I have no more legitimacy, or I need to incorporate these people to actually progress. That's the big difference. For example, what happened in Indonesia, who had oil in the early 1970s, compared to Nigeria, who had oil a little bit later, where in Indonesia, they used the oil at the same time to kind of pay off the elites, it's a longer story, but also allow investment to come in, FDI from Japan, and build up a whole manufacturing industry and changing the elite structure. In fact, Suharto in the end lost power because of the growth and the changes that happened after the Asian crisis. And so in a sense, it is a gamble. It paid off for a long time. And I think in some countries, the status quo is so embedded and so comfortable that actually it's not a growth-oriented model that you then get. So and it's self-interested, it's survival, it's maybe seeing the money opportunity, and it's these things, But
you catch the golden beans in the end, is what you're saying. At the end, we could see it, and that's the gamble, that the end could justify the means.
Yes. Well, in a sense, for you as a player in it, it could do. But, these gambles don't always succeed. If we look at Ethiopia, which is unfortunately rife with conflict now, since about 2003 up to about 2018, 2019, the elite bargain for this relatively small group of people that controlled power was, we're going to do it via economic growth and development.
Yep.
We're going to get legitimacy through development. The political bargain was always weak between these different nationalities. And we know the story, dominated by one of the ethnic groups, by the Tigrayans and so on. It was complicated. At some point, a political deal falls apart. And actually, the gamble at the moment is, let's say, on hold. I'm not saying that it can't come back, but it doesn't look that good. So, but it was a gamble of the elite at that moment. And you remember, all the people fighting now were part of that elite bargain initially. They were actually saying, let's try it via the economy, but they couldn't keep the country together. So, several of the businessmen that gambled on the growth there, they will have lost big way now. And so it's not necessarily a guaranteed success. That's why it is a gamble.
For sure.
Do you think this development word or buzzword or pressure could actually lead to some trap? So where a leader comes in, and because they're feeling that I've got to deliver on development for the people, for me to deliver on development and look like I'm different from the previous leader, then I've got to be a bit more radical, introduce my own ideas. So we just end up having start, instead of having continuity, which could also be, for example, we've got Vision 2030. We are only 7 years to the end of Vision 2030. We've been looking at medium-term plan 1, 2, 3, 4. We're on MTP 4. But if you look at MTP 1, 2, 3, truth be told, some work has been done, but a lot has not been done. Instead of leaders just coming in and saying, we are continuing from where the other person left, going into our shift is MTP 2 or 3, and this is what we are expected to deliver. So leaders just come in and they're thinking, I've got to, leave my mark. And this is what my definition is going to be. The man who outdid the other one on infrastructure, the man who outdid the other one on agriculture. And you just end up having all these different things. It becomes a development trap.
Yes. Whether it's a trap or not. For me, actually, where I take my optimism from is that actually, if I go back to 1990 compared to now, there are so many countries who actually seem to have started their takeoff. And so actually, despite what you describe, which I recognize, the incentives are there in political cycles to deliver or personality cycles to deliver in the short term. That's the curse of politics, is that it forces you to be short term because, all the time the pressure are there to deliver. But quite a few countries have been able to do sufficiently long-term development to actually do it. But you come back a little bit, Vision 2030, it's not as bad as some of the development plans I've seen in DRC. I mean, content-wise, there's nothing wrong with it. But it comes back to this kind of how committed are you to set up a coalition that jointly we are going to develop it. So the problem with the development plan culture is that actually the document comes first before actually getting the political consensus to deliver it.
Right.
I actually am a strong believer is that development will come from the political consensus, cross parties and so on, that certain things need to happen. And then you get your vision. So then you'll get a more healthy way that when the one person leaves, then the road will not be left half finished, but actually the road will be finished, and so on. So that and for anything that's long term, you need to be willing to work. It's something that is not dependent on just your tenure, and it's a hard one. That's the art of politics. And I've worked with politicians. I couldn't be one. I admire, actually, surprisingly, I have a very positive view of politicians because it's a bloody difficult job. It's a really difficult job to do because of the pressures you describe. But you come back to the leadership, the coalition formation, the like-minded people, the team you built around you, the continuity versus the rupture. You need to show rupture, but you should actually have enough continuity and so on. Interesting times in Kenya to see what that balance will be and how you progress.
Just looking at the same example that you were giving of Deng Xiaoping. So he starts this thing saying, let's open up the economy. Let's allow people to go and study abroad and live abroad. Let them come back. Let's have, social transformation in the country. The next guy that comes continues with that. And then this was Jiang Zemin. Hu Jintao comes and focuses on infrastructure. Rail, this and the other.
Build cities.
And all these things.
No one lives,
Xi Jinping is continuing with that, but also just transforming. Do you think this is still continuing the original plan that was there, or is each of these leaders coming in and saying, I'm going to do my own thing?
Yeah. I think what hasn't gone away, and I'm not going to judge, I find it so much harder to judge what President Xi is doing at the moment. But so up to him, in the end, there is a certain progression. And what is common on it is that they want to get legitimacy from their population through growth and development. That's the, if you're a Marxist regime, there is no afterlife. So, you better, you have to live it here.
Blood on the floor.
And that's, it's a self-evident thing that they can't have that. So in a sense, there is continuity there because that focal point, initially it was food security and then it became growth and then it became broader development. It is there, that's a continuing. And I think that's what I'm actually saying. So it's that underlying commitment to actually say, yes, you do slightly different things, but you keep that commitment because it leads you not to leave half your roads unfinished. Yeah. It leads you not to suddenly shift to other provinces where you say, oh, no, now I need to focus on other province than I was before. That's the kind of an element of the continuity. It's a national agenda and there's a continuity. And that's what democracies find that harder. And I will say that. But it's not because of autocracy that they do it well. Some of the worst performing countries in the world are autocratic systems as well. So we actually say, in fact, in the book, I say for that early stages, it doesn't in itself matter that much. It's what you do with it, And if an autocratic system, you have to then really do it as legitimacy building. If you do it as democratic system, you should be willing to play that it's not just a narrow, zero-sum game, I win, you lose, and a kind of thing. So it's how you use the system.
How you use
that will determine where you get.
Prof, thank you very much for joining us. Quickly, in about 10 seconds, tell us where can one get the book? Or
Well,
when is the book coming out?
Just put some pressure on your bookshops. I know a few of them. So it's published by Hearst. There's several bookshops that normally buy the books from Hearst. I know they're in touch with them. So put a bit of pressure. If you can get your online deliveries happened as well, it's shipped from anywhere and it reaches quite quickly. But I think, there's a couple of places here that are probably
Already
about
stocking the book.
about stock it. And it's quick delivery. It's a nice book. And, and follow me on Twitter. I'm Gambling on Dev. And you can see some more conversation there.
All right. At Gambling on Dev on Twitter, Professor Stefan Dercon, Professor of Economic Policy from Oxford. Thank you very much for joining us.